Hey, my name is Cal Merritt. I'm 32 years old, and I live in a two-bedroom unit on the third floor of a place called Ashford Arms, a squat brick building on the east side of Millhaven, Wisconsin, that has probably looked exactly the same since 1974. The hallway smells like floor wax and old carpet. The elevator has been broken since February, and the property manager, a soft-spoken man named Arthur, keeps promising it will be fixed by the end of the month. He's been saying that since March. I work for the city's water and wastewater department. My job title is Distribution System Operator, which is a technical way of saying I spend my days monitoring pipe networks, reading pressure gauges, responding to main breaks, and making sure the water coming out of people's taps is what it's supposed to be. I've been doing it for 6 years. Most people don't think about their water until something goes wrong with it, which means when people think about me at all, it's usually not a great day for them. I don't take that personally. The system doesn't need to be noticed. It just needs to work. I understand that. My mornings follow the same pattern they have for about 3 years now. I wake up at 5:10, before the alarm. I make coffee, 1 mug, black, the same brand every week. I check the overnight incident reports on my phone while I drink it. I shower. I put on the same kind of clothes, dark work pants and a department issue shirt, eat something fast over the sink, and leave the apartment by 6:15. I take the stairs because of the elevator. I walk to my truck in the far corner of the lot, back it out, and I'm on the road before most of the building is woken up. I didn't think anyone noticed. I'm not a particularly social person. I know my neighbors the way you know background noise, familiar without being known, the man in 3A who watches sports at a volume that comes through the wall like weather, the retired woman in 2C who leaves her cat's food dish in the hallway and apologizes for it every time we pass each other, even though I've told her 4 times it doesn't bother me. The young couple in 2A who fight and then laugh and then fight again, and whose cycles feel as predictable as the pressure schedules at work. I didn't know who lived in 3C. I'd seen the door. It's directly across the hall from mine, close enough that you could reach out from one doormat to the other. For the first 1.5 years I lived in 3B. The door across from me had belonged to an older man named Gerald, who'd moved out when his daughter got him a place closer to her in Green Bay. After Gerald, the unit sat empty for about 4 months. Then, one evening last October, I came home from a 14-hour shift involving a broken main on Birchwood Street and a leak we traced back to a corroded coupling from the 1980s, and I heard someone moving furniture on the other side of the door. Dragging sounds, the low thump of something heavy being set down wrong. I'd thought about knocking. I didn't. I was tired, and I smelled like pipe ditch. I told myself I'd introduce myself another time. And then another time came and went, and so did a dozen more, and by January I still didn't know anything about 3C except that sometimes there was light under the door when I left in the morning, and sometimes there wasn't. I had gotten used to not knowing things. It was a habit I'd developed a while back. I'm not sure exactly when it started, but if I had to name a point, I'd say it was sometime after the fall I spent trying to understand why a woman I'd been with for 2 years had one day looked at me across a dinner table and said she felt like she was living with someone who was also somewhere else entirely. I hadn't known how to argue with that because I'd suspected she was right even before she said it. We ended things without drama, which had felt like maturity at the time and in the years since had started to feel more like evidence. 2 people can end something civilly when neither of them was all the way in to begin with. After that, I'd gotten comfortable with the apartment, with the routine, with the way a life can run cleanly and without interruption when you've reduced it to tasks you know how to do. That was where I was on a Wednesday morning in late February when I opened my door at 6:12 and found a folded piece of paper tucked into the doorframe. It wasn't taped. It wasn't in an envelope. It was just folded once and slid into the gap between the door and the frame, about chest height, so that it fell into my hand when I pulled the door open. I stood there in my jacket with my coffee mug and I looked at it. My first thought, in the way that first thoughts arrive before you can organize them, was that it had something to do with Arthur and the elevator. I unfolded it. It was written in pen, in handwriting that was neat but slightly rushed, like someone who'd made up their mind to do something and wanted to do it before they talked themselves out of it. I know this is strange, but I watch you leave every morning from my peephole, and I always smile. I don't know your name. I just wanted you to know. No name, no apartment number, no indication of what I was supposed to do with that information. I stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the door of 3C. The light was on underneath it. I could hear, very faintly, the sound of a kettle. I folded the note back along its crease and put it in my jacket pocket and went to work. I turned it over in my head most of the day. That's the thing about work that involves monitoring and maintenance. There is a lot of time to think. I was running valve inspections in the Northeast sector, and the job is physical enough to keep your hands busy but not complicated enough to take over your whole brain, so the note kept coming back to me in between readings. What I couldn't figure out was the feeling I'd had when I read it. It wasn't alarm. It wasn't quite embarrassment, though there was something adjacent to that in there. It was more like the sensation you get when you're running a diagnostic on a system you thought you understood and a pressure reading comes back just slightly outside of normal. Not wrong enough to be an emergency, but enough to make you pay attention. Something was different from how you'd mapped it. Someone had been watching me leave every morning and smiling about it. Not for a day or two. Long enough that it felt worth writing down. I didn't know anything about the person who had written the note. I'd been assuming it was a woman based on the handwriting, which I knew was not a reliable assumption, and based on some instinct I couldn't fully name. I'd never seen the door of 3C open. I'd never heard a voice through it, only movement. The note had been written with some care. The sentence, "I don't know your name," struck me as a precise thing to include, because it meant the note wasn't meant as the beginning of a conversation. It was just meant to say, "This happened, and I wanted you to know it happened." It hadn't asked me for anything. On my way home that evening, I stopped at the deli on Carlisle and bought enough for 2 sandwiches without entirely understanding why. I told myself I was just buying extra in case I was hungry later. I ate one standing at the counter and looked at the second one for a while before I wrapped it up and put it in the bag. I got home at 6:45. The light was on under 3C. I stood at my own door for probably 20 seconds longer than I needed to. Then I knocked. The silence on the other side of the door lasted long enough that I'd already started to feel foolish about the sandwich. Then I heard footsteps, unhurried, and the sound of the chain being considered before the door opened about 6 inches. She was younger than I'd somehow assumed. Mid to late 20s, maybe. Dark circles under her eyes, like someone who either worked nights or hadn't been sleeping well. Dark hair pulled back with a pencil still in it. She was wearing a large gray cardigan over what looked like paint-stained jeans, and she was holding a book with her thumb marking a page, which meant she'd been reading when I knocked. She looked at me with an expression I could only describe as composed alertness. She wasn't startled, but she was paying attention. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me. "I got your note," I said. She looked at the sandwich bag in my hand, then back at me. Something in her face softened by about a millimeter. "I wasn't sure you'd knock," she said. I wasn't sure I would either. She considered that. I'm Nora. Cal, she opened the door a little wider, not all the way, but enough. I should apologize. It was a weird thing to do. It was, I said. I brought you a sandwich. She looked at the bag again. Why? I don't know, I said, which was the most honest answer I had. She didn't invite me in that night, and I didn't expect her to. We stood in the doorway for about 15 minutes while she ate the sandwich, and I leaned against the opposite wall, and she asked me what I did, and I told her about the water department. She nodded slowly, in the way people do when they're actually filing the information rather than just performing interest. So you know what's under all of it, she said. The streets, all the pipes and the valves, most of it. Millhaven's network isn't that complicated once you've been working it a while. That's a strange way to know a city. I'd never thought about it that way. I suppose it is. She told me she was a graphic designer, freelance, mostly. She'd moved to Millhaven from Madison 7 months ago, which meant she'd been in 3C since October, which meant I'd heard her moving furniture on the night I'd come home from the Birchwood Street break. She said Millhaven was cheaper and quieter, and she was trying to finish a project she'd been putting off for 2 years. I asked what the project was. A book, she said. Children's, illustrated, about a girl who lives underground and thinks the whole world is tunnels. She paused. I just realized that probably sounds different to you. A little, I said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but close. She asked me something then that I wasn't expecting. She said, "Does it bother you when people don't notice it? The water. All that work, and no one thinks about it." I thought about that. The system doesn't need to be noticed, I said. It just needs to work. She looked at me for a moment. That's kind of a lonely way to think about it. I didn't have a response to that. She finished the sandwich, folded the wrapper with more neatness than the situation required, and said she should get back to the book. I said goodnight and went across the hall to my apartment and stood in my kitchen for a while, not turning on the television. We didn't plan anything after that. It happened the way things happen in buildings, by proximity, by accident, by the repetition of ordinary timing. She kept odd hours. I kept early ones. But sometimes in the evenings, coming up the stairs at roughly the same moment, we'd end up in the hallway together. She had a way of leaning against her own doorframe while we talked, holding the door half open behind her, as if she hadn't quite decided whether the conversation was going to be worth staying for. After a while, I noticed she stopped doing that. She'd just stand in the hallway, fully present, arms crossed loosely over whatever she was wearing that day. She showed me the book one evening, about 3 weeks after the note. She'd been working on it for longer than she wanted to admit, and she said she didn't show it to people, but she brought it to the door in a flat portfolio case and opened it on the floor of the hallway, because the lighting was better there than anywhere else in her apartment. The illustrations were dense and precise, underground chambers mapped with the same logic as actual infrastructure. Streets labeled from below with their real names. The girl at the center of the story moved through the tunnels with a headlamp and a hand-drawn map that was always one section out of date. She keeps having to redraw it, Nora said. Because the tunnels keep changing. Tunnels don't usually change. Hers do. She tilted one of the pages slightly to show me a corner panel, the girl pressing her hand to the wall and a crack spreading from her palm in a branching pattern that looked like a pipe diagram. She's the reason they change. She doesn't know that yet. I looked at the illustration for longer than I probably needed to. That's a lot to carry. She's 7, Nora said. She thinks she's exploring. She doesn't know she's building. She closed the portfolio with the same careful neatness she'd used on the sandwich wrapper. We were sitting on the floor of the hallway by then, backs against opposite walls, and she looked at me with an expression I was starting to recognize, measured, a little dry, slightly more open than she probably intended. "You can say it," she said. "Say what?" "That it's autobiographical." I wasn't going to say that. Everyone says it. She wasn't bothered by it, just noting the pattern. I was going to say, "It's precise," I said. "The way things work. You understand how they actually function." She looked at the portfolio. "I spent a long time in a city I didn't understand," she said. "Madison, I was with someone there. He was from there, his whole life was there, and I kept trying to understand the city through him, and that worked until it didn't, and then I didn't understand anything." She said it the way I described meter readings. Flat, factual. The emotional charge held below the surface. When it ended, I needed to go somewhere I could learn the geography myself. I understood what she meant, even though she hadn't said it directly. The needing to map something alone. The way a place can feel foreign when you've been reading it through someone else. "Was it bad?" I asked, when it ended. She thought about it. "He was a good person," she said, which somehow made it harder. There was no one to be angry at. She picked up the portfolio case. "Okay, that's the sad chapter. Your turn. I told you about the pipes." "Everyone has a sad chapter, Cal." I told her about the dinner table. The woman who said I was somewhere else. The way I hadn't been able to argue with it. I told it the same way she'd told hers, plain, factual, with the judgment held back. She listened without interrupting, which was something I'd noticed about her from the beginning. She didn't fill silences with reassurance. "Do you think she was right?" she asked when I'd finished. "Probably, but not anymore." I looked at her. She was watching me with those measured eyes, and there was something in the question that was more than casual, but she'd phrased it to give me a way out if I needed one. "I'm here," I said. She nodded slowly, like I'd given her something to file. March came in cold, and we developed what I can only call a routine, not a planned one. Just the accumulation of small, regular things. She began knocking on my door on Saturday mornings, with 2 coffees from the place 3 blocks over. The real kind, in paper cups with sleeves. And we'd sit in my apartment or hers, and she'd work on the book, and I'd do whatever maintenance task the weekend required. I fixed a cabinet hinge in her kitchen that she'd been living around for weeks. She proofread a water quality report I needed to submit. Not because it needed proofreading, but because she was curious about what the language of it actually meant. We made dinner together on Thursdays. It wasn't romantic, or it wasn't only romantic. It was practical in the way 2 people who live across a narrow hallway from each other can develop practical arrangements. She was better at cooking than I was, which she stated as a simple fact without making it a competition. I was better at knowing when something was wrong before it became a problem, which she said was a useful thing to be around. One Thursday in the middle of March, she was on a call with a client when I arrived. I let myself in. She'd given me a key 2 weeks earlier for no stated reason other than that she sometimes lost hers, and I started on the pasta because I knew where everything was. The call was going badly. I could tell from the tone even without hearing the words. She was standing at the window with her back to the room, very still, using the kind of careful, measured voice that means you're containing something larger. When she hung up, she stood there for a moment without turning around. "He wants to change the ending," she said. "The publisher? The editor? The ending where she figures out she's the one who built the tunnels. He thinks it's too ambiguous. He wants her to actually come up to the surface at the end. See the world from above." I stirred the pasta. "Does she need to?" "No, flat and certain." "Then tell him that." She turned around. Her eyes were red, not from crying, but from the kind of pressure that comes before it. "He's the one with the contract." "He's the one with the contract for the book you wrote," I said. "Not the one he wants instead." She looked at me for a long moment. I went back to the pasta. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened her laptop, and I heard her typing. Not the scattered, reconsidering typing, but the fast, certain kind that means someone has found the sentence. We ate late after she'd sent the email. She was quiet in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, the quiet of someone who'd done something they needed to do. "You know what I think it is?" she said, near the end of the meal. "What?" "The tunnel thing. People see a girl underground and they want to fix it. They think underground is wrong." She turned her fork in her hand. "But she built it. It's hers. She's not trapped. She's home." I thought about the pressure networks, the way the whole invisible system lives below the streets and keeps everything above it alive, and nobody thinks about it until something stops working. "Sometimes the most important things are the ones no one can see," I said. She looked at me across the table. "Okay," she said. Now that was autobiographical. The first week of April, her ex-boyfriend showed up. I didn't know that's what he was at first. I heard the knock from across the hall. It was about 8 in the evening, and then voices through the door, and the particular quality of silence that comes between difficult sentences. I wasn't listening intentionally. Sound travels in that hallway the way pressure travels in a closed system. It finds the path of least resistance and arrives somewhere you didn't expect it. About 20 minutes later, I heard her door open and close, and then she knocked on mine. She looked the same as she had when the editor call went badly. Eyes red pressured. Posture very straight. The specific stillness of someone who has just had to hold their ground. "Can I sit here for a while?" she asked. Yes. She sat on my couch and pulled her knees up, and I didn't ask her anything. I made tea and set it in front of her and sat in the chair across the room, and after about 10 minutes she started talking. His name was Daniel. She'd been with him for almost 3 years in Madison. When she'd left the city, she'd told him clearly, she thought clearly, that she needed to do this alone. He had not received that as clearly as she'd stated it. He'd been texting periodically since October, and she'd answered some of them in the way you answer someone you don't want to hurt. She said she'd made the mistake of being kind when she should have been direct. "He came to say he wants to try again," she said. "He drove 4 hours. What did you tell him? That I'm not the person who was with him anymore, that even if I wanted to go back, which I don't, there's nowhere to go back to." "Did he hear that?" "He heard it," she said. "He didn't accept it." She held the mug. "He asked if there was someone else." I waited. I told him that wasn't the relevant question. She looked at me over the rim of the mug, but I thought about what I would have said if I'd been honest. The room was quiet for a moment. The building settled, the way old buildings do in the evening. I didn't know what to say, I told her. For a long time, about most things. I think I let a lot of things stay unresolved because I didn't know how to start. "You're starting now," she said. "I'm trying." She set the mug down. She looked at me with those direct, considering eyes, and she said, "Cal, I left a note on your door. I have been leaving invisible notes on your door for 4 months. I need you to be less careful." I looked at her. "Okay," I said. I moved to the couch. We sat there for a while, shoulder to shoulder, and I didn't say anything else because I didn't need to. And after a while she leaned her head against my shoulder in a way that felt like the end of something being held back for a long time. Daniel knocked on my door the next morning. I opened it, and he was standing there, tall, good-looking in the way of someone who knew it. wearing the kind of jacket that cost more than it needed to. He looked at me with the expression of someone assembling a situation. "You're across the hall," he said. "I am." "She tell you about me?" "Yes." He studied me for a moment. "I just want to talk to her." "She told you what she needed to tell you last night," I said. "I don't think another conversation is going to give you something different." "That's not your decision. It's hers," I said. "She already made it." He looked past me into the apartment, as if he'd find something useful in there. Then he looked back at me, and his expression did something complicated. Not quite anger, not quite grief. Some combination of the two that people wear when the version of events they'd been carrying doesn't survive contact with reality. "She moved here and just started over," he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was almost just observation. "She built something new," I said. "That's not the same as starting over." He stood there for another moment. Then he left. I heard him knock on 3C once, lightly, and when there was no answer, he went down the stairs. I listened to his footsteps until they were gone. When I knocked on Nora's door 5 minutes later, she opened it immediately, which meant she'd been standing just on the other side of it. "You heard," she said. "He knocked." She looked at me. "What did you say to him?" "That you'd built something new." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and took my hand, just held it, looking at our hands with the same focused attention she gave to the illustrations. "Accurate," she said. 6 months after the note, the elevator at Ashford Arms was still broken. Arthur had promised it by the end of July. It was now late August, and he'd moved the projection to the end of September, and Nora had taped a small drawing to the elevator doors, a girl with a headlamp, a hand-drawn map, and a tunnel stretching in front of her that could have been going anywhere. Most people in the building had smiled at it. 2 people had left notes thanking whoever put it there. Arthur had left it up. Nora's book sold in June. Not to the editor who wanted the surface ending. She'd walked away from that contract after 3 rounds of revisions that kept trying to drag the girl into daylight. A smaller press in Chicago had picked it up without changes. The tunnel stayed. The girl stayed underground, with her changing map and her spreading cracks and her headlamp. Publication date was set for next spring. She was working on the 2nd book now. This one was about a boy who monitors a city's water system from below and slowly figures out that the water knows where it needs to go and is always known. He just has to read the pressure. She told me the premise over coffee one Saturday morning in my apartment, watching me not quite hide my smile, and said, "Don't make it weird." I didn't say anything. "You had a face. I'm allowed to have a face." She leaned across the kitchen table and kissed me, quick and deliberate, the way she made decisions, without drama and without apology. Then she went back to her drawing board, which now lived against the east wall of my apartment, because her place had better light in the mornings and mine had better light in the evenings, and we had stopped pretending the division of the hallway made any real sense. I made a 2nd cup of coffee and stood at the window. Below, the streets of Millhaven moved through their ordinary morning, traffic lights cycling. A delivery truck double-parked on Carlisle. Children walking to the school on Birch with backpacks that made them look top-heavy. All of it moving on the surface, unhurried and unremarkable. And underneath, invisible and essential, the network I'd spent 6 years reading. The pipes carrying water to every tap and every kettle and every coffee maker in 1,000 apartments. The pressure gauges holding steady, the valves holding open. The whole careful infrastructure of an ordinary life working the way it was supposed to work and asking nothing in return except to be tended to. I thought about a note folded and tucked into a doorframe. about the particular kind of courage it takes to say, "I notice you," to someone you don't know, about a girl who spends her life mapping tunnels that keep changing and doesn't yet understand that she's the reason they change, that her own presence in the system is what's making it grow. I had spent a long time believing that the best thing a person could be was the kind of thing that didn't need to be noticed, that the goal was to function cleanly, without drawing attention, without requiring anything from anyone. I had been wrong about that. Not about the functioning, that part was fine, but about the noticing. It turns out a system runs better when someone knows it's there, when someone checks the readings not because something is broken, but because they want to know how it's doing. When someone leaves a note in the doorframe just to say, "I see you," every morning, and you make me smile. Maybe the best infrastructure is the kind that has someone paying attention to it. And maybe that's not a systems principle at all. Maybe that's just what love is, in the particular quiet language of people who learned it late and arrived at it carefully and are grateful, in a way that doesn't need to be said out loud. For every ordinary morning they get to come back to it.